Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today we have two guests on the episode. We have Justin Moore of Parabolic Performance and Cody Plofker of Adapt Performance and Rehab. Today, Cody and Justin talk about numerous topics ranging from intern and coaching development, working in the private sector, how they got into the private sector, some of the ins and outs of the business, running a private sector or a gym. They talked about their assessments and how they might differ from the performance side compared to the therapy side of their businesses. They also talked about how PRI influences their assessment and also their coaching strategies and how they apply some of the principles of PRI into their coaching, some of their big compound lifts such as a squat and deadlift. And finally, they talk about their NFL Combine and Pro Day training, specifically the 40-yard dash and how they work from setup to start and through the initial acceleration and kind of some of the components of the 40-yard dash that they work with their NFL Combine and Pro Day athletes. Overall, it was a great episode. Justin and Cody are two young coaches who I think are really, really bright, really willing to share information. So it was a good episode. Two good guys to connect with, talk shop with. Really open to sharing of how and what they do in their day-to-day practice. So it was a great episode with Justin and Cody. So without further ado, let's talk to the guys. Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today we have on our podcast, we have Cody Plofker of Adapt Performance and Rehab and Justin Moore of Parabolic Performance. Guys, how you doing today?
Doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me. Really pleasure to meet you and get talk shop, and especially with Cody. It's been a while since me and him got to sit down and talk about this stuff.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to be on. Excited to share some stuff and learn from you guys as always.
Perfect. Cody, let's start with you. Give us a little background of what you're currently doing and kind of how you got there.
So currently I've opened my own sports performance and physical therapy company called Adapt Performance and Rehab. We're located near Princeton, New Jersey. So we've been open for about 4 or 5 months. Prior to this, I was working with Justin doing a lot of the same training, doing the combine training with him and just working at another sports performance and physical therapy facility. Prior to that, I was in school and I've just interned at a few places before that. I've interned at Peak Performance in New York. But what kind of got me into the field was I was actually playing golf in high school and college. And I know it's not common for golfers to train, but I kind of just started training to see if I could get a little bit better, hit the ball a little bit further. And then there were just a few injuries that kind of I had that never really were able to go away. So I kind of just tried to learn as much as I could about how the body moves and stuff, and kind of got hooked on learning and just kind of went from there.
Yeah, I've seen your barefoot swing on the course, man. It looks good.
Thanks, man.
You can hit the crap out of the ball.
I got it a little bit.
Justin, how about you?
So I kind of came up doing just about everything you could possibly do as an athlete. And I was an athlete my whole life. And luckily my parents pushed me to kind of engage in many different sports. But when I got to high school and college, I specialized in football. It just kind of fit after playing soccer my whole life. I was getting tossed out of games and getting a lot of red cards because I kind of like to hit people. So figured I'd just go do the football thing. But when I got to college, I started running into problems. Like I actually had 7 surgeries in the 6 years that I finished up my master's in college. I played D3 ball. But what I realized after I tore my ACL for the first time, and I actually tore it 3 times in that period on the same knee, was, I'd gotten out of shape and I wasn't feeling like myself. I couldn't play. And I began to kind of find the weight room as a way to not only work to get myself back towards being on the field where I wanted to be, but to kind of reinvent myself as a person. Like I struggled with my weight my whole life. And I wanted to get in shape and finally figure out how to kind of put that behind me. And so strength training and the weight room became my way to do that. And it also became an outlet for stress to deal with the recovery process. And so I kind of fell in love with it during that period. And I was going to school for communications and sports administration. So most people don't know I don't have a background in this scientifically at all. And I kind of realized as I finished up my college career that I didn't want to wear, a suit and tie and work in an office all day. I kind of fell in love with the weight room, and I wanted to make that what I did and make that my profession and help people by sharing good knowledge that I never had, that it took me until that point to get. And so I got an internship at Seton Hall as I finished up grad school, worked with their strength and conditioning staff. That was a great opportunity. And then I got pretty lucky, honestly. I was going through the NSCA website one night, and I saw that a guy named Angelo Todaro had put out a feeler for interns for parabolic performance and rehab. And so I just contacted him and said I wanted to volunteer my time and try to get more experience. And that internship turned into a part-time coaching gig, turned into a full-time coaching gig, turned into head of the Combine program, and then finally into being the director of performance education at Parabolic, which is my current role. So not only do I work Cody and I actually worked for about a year to put the modules together that we use for our onboarding process, for our interns, and for our internal education. But then I also spent a lot of time working with different coaches, working with new interns within the facility to try to bring them up to our standard and to constantly be pushing the envelope of what we know at Parabolic and what we do. And then also every year, once Combine comes around, I'm the head guy for that.
Awesome. Let's go on that path of bringing on new coaches on board or interns, because I'm sure you guys get a lot, as do I. And Cody, I'm sure you will in the future get a lot of interns you guys work with. But so what do those steps look like? What are some of the initial processes that you guys use at Parabolic to introduce interns to you guys' program? What are some of those modules or initial modules look like?
So we basically set it up so that I believe there's 14 modules, and the initial one is basically like a broad overview, a 10,000 foot view of what it is that we do there. And so that includes our belief system on assessment, the quality of movement before, adding volume, load, speed, etc. Making sure that we're connecting with the person as an individual. And then on top of that, just beginning to appreciate movement over parts, right? Like a lot of these interns come from school and their mindset is very much still that of a regular personal trainer or somebody who's, when are we working on the triceps and the biceps and what muscle does this work? So it's kind of just beginning to give them an understanding of the way that we approach training from a movement perspective and appreciating how the human organism moves, how it adapts, and the different things that we have to consider before we go and train somebody safely. So that's kind of module one, and it includes a PDF, a webinar, and a PowerPoint presentation. And so that gives them their kind of out of the facility learning. They have to go through those. They have to report back to either me or their site manager, and we have a discussion about that. And then on top of that, we'll include different articles that I feel are relevant from guys like Mike Robertson, Bill Hartman, different things from, if we're talking about speed, it'll be things from Just Fly and a number of different sources. But I've compiled a pretty substantial list, Eric Cressy's of the world and these guys, and I have them read those, and then they come in and again, we have a discussion about it. And we say, how is this relevant? What do you feel this brings to the table and what did you take away? And then I will listen to them and then I'll kind of give them why I feel that's so important and why I feel this content is important. And then the last part is just kind of the total immersion treatment. It's they need to be on the floor, seeing what actually happens in a live coaching session, interacting with people, and hearing the cues that I give. And I always encourage all of our interns, ask as many questions of me as you possibly can. Question everything, because I know it can be overwhelming at first, but let's start somewhere. And I think that's really important for them because, what they learn in school, for that to transfer over to what we're doing on the floor, sometimes there's a big gap there. And what is happening in the field now, the textbooks haven't caught up with it yet. So that kind of appreciation of how to run a training session, how to interact with somebody, is really important. And then first and foremost, the first day they're there, I tell them, get on the floor, go say hi, introduce yourself to every client you see. And then I want you to report back to me with 1 to 2 things about each person that you've talked to. Because if they can't build a rapport and build a relationship with the people that they're, that they're coaching, then they're going to have no chance of being successful with them.
Awesome. Cody, anything to add, or have you had interns that adapt yet?
I'm actually having my first intern start tomorrow.
All right. So what's your process look like here leading up to tomorrow and starting from there?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I've been so busy just running everything myself that I haven't actually been able to plan it out. But I'm going to go through with them and essentially create our own curriculum throughout the 16 weeks or whatever he's going to be there for. And because we don't have anything recorded like the modules, I'm essentially just going to create the curriculum and kind of sit down and give them about an hour presentation on each one once a week. And that'll go over all the topics from kind of just a general intro, assessment basics, program design, like order of the workout and all that kind of stuff. Cause I think we take for granted, like how little of this stuff these guys are actually taught in school.
Yep.
We'll go through a topic on energy systems development. We'll go through one on, probably one on linear speed, one on agility, one on strength, one on power, just kind of all your big rocks that we think a young coach should be able to know, that they're probably not getting at school. But by the end of the program, I know this is kind of always me and Justin plan was like, you're going to leave here being a representation of us. And, we want you to leave here being like a fully functional coach that, we'd feel comfortable putting you out on the floor or having you write a program for somebody, just like the coach would.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I mean, I always start with our interns. I tell them, again, we have kind of modules that we give up beforehand, but I interned at a Big Ten school and I was basically a glorified spotter and cleaner upper. Got to do basically no coaching, and that was the exact opposite, I think, what these kids need. And so I tell these coaches or interns like you guys do that you guys are going to coach. You're going to get your hands dirty. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to try new things, and it's going to be tough. You're going to be uncomfortable. But I think that's like you said, at the end of the 16, 20 weeks, at the end of the day, it's our brand that's kind of stamped onto them. And so if they're not a good representation of what you've kind of worked on, it kind of, is a bad symbol for yourself. So that's what we try to do as well.
There's actually one other thing that I just realized the other day that is I mean, I've thought about it before, and Cody and I have talked about it a lot, but it's doing exactly what you're going to coach before you leave. And I think that's something that also gets missed. Like, I had our interns go through a full warm up with our combine guys the other day. Next week, they're going to go through, start with one PRI corrective activity, and they're going to go through each of those. They're going to squat, hinge, push, and pull. And like, if you don't train, and if they don't actually participate in what they're going to be coaching, I don't think you have any chance of being able to relate information to people. Like, you have to have experienced what they're going through. You have to have experienced what it's like to try to find a certain muscle, or to perform, a certain skip variation, or to actually do, a double kettlebell rack squat, and to feel what they're feeling in order to be able to relate to them exactly what cues, kinematics, and things that you're trying to impart to them. And I think that's huge, is with interns, is just getting them to actually experience it themselves.
Absolutely. Good point. So let's talk about you guys in the private sector. So Cody, let's start with you. You decided to basically open up your own performance and physical therapy business. Talk us through the process of doing that and what led you to that decision.
So I'll say that was kind of always a goal of mine. Since I kind of knew I wanted to be in this industry and be a strength coach, it was kind of always my goal was to own my own facility. This definitely happened probably sooner than I was expecting, but just was kind of no longer happy with where I was and was looking for something else. And to be honest, I just really didn't find anywhere that I was kind of really, jumping at to apply to. So just decided, why not? Let's just do it. Open up my own place. We're located inside of a big sports complex, kind of similar to where Justin's at, about half an hour apart, but it's 100,000 square foot turf, and we're located right inside of that. So a lot of athletes coming through there, mostly lacrosse, really big down in that area, some soccer and field hockey, but that's kind of the goal. We have physical therapy and performance, and I honestly, after working with physical therapists once, I just would not be able to kind of do it again without them. I think it brings so much to the table to have a facility or a company that bridges the gap. I believe there's such a need for it, definitely, and kind of can serve our athletes a lot better. So a lot of the athletes we see actually end up utilizing both of our services, and it's kind of one of the big thing that I think draws them to us, because they really like the the collaboration and the kind of knowing exactly what they should be doing to get them back on the field properly. So been open for about 4 or 5 months, and everything's going really well.
Question: how do you adapt? How do you guys integrate your performance and physical therapy? Is it an all-inclusive program, or how do you guys kind of divvy up if someone wants some sort of physical therapy treatment or recovery modalities? How do you guys bridge that gap? That's something that I've looked into. Just wondering how you guys do it.
Right now we don't have any like specific packages. I mean, when they come to us and they become a lead, they'll generally inquire about something, and usually it's pretty standard that we know where they're going to go. You know, we'll either start, both of our assessments and consultations are free, so we kind of know where they're going to go. They'll be like, hey, I want to get better at my sport, or, you know, I got this injury, so we'll try to steer them. There are times where, you know, someone will come to us and they'll say, hey, I want to get faster, I want to get better, but I also have this pain going on. And we'll, you know, sometimes we won't know we'll have to decide, should we start with performance? We'll do an assessment there. And then if I find anything upon the assessment that I think should be, you know, evaluated by a medical professional, I'll send it over to therapy, or we might start the other way. But I guess that's kind of the common way we do it is, you know, if I'm going through the assessment and someone's telling me their back's hurting or something like that, I'll say, hey, you know what, like, let me go introduce you to Dr. Pyle. Let's see if you guys can set up a consultation. It's only half an hour. It's free. And I really think that, you know, it could help you guys kind of set a good game plan. At the very least, she can kind of give me a little bit more information with her expertise about how we can modify your program to get the best results for you. But it's also pretty common to go the other way, where someone will come in just for therapy and they'll go through their treatment plan. And at the end of it, you know, we'll kind of recommend that to get back into their sports, they kind of need to do a month or two of training just to kind of get back to that level and kind of build off of where they left therapy off. Because, you know, they're going to be doing exercises, they're going to be squatting and hinging and all that stuff. But just to kind of get to a higher level, a lot of times it's great to take that rehab plan that they've just been doing and, you know, build some strength on top of it.
Justin, how do you guys do it?
So very similarly, we have the performance and PT realm all under one roof within the same building and the same space. We'll have people come in. They will go through their performance assessment, just as Cody said. If there's pain, if there's serious dysfunction, if there's something that I know is going to be hindering their performance goals or their training, then I'll refer them to PT and say, hey, listen, we have these great physical therapists in-house. And then they'll run their insurance and they'll go through that kind of process. But that's been huge for us from all of our athletes as well as Gen Pop, and especially now during Combine, because as I spoke about on the Just Fly Performance podcast, there's kind of a difference between what's going on in the physical therapy realm and what's going on in the performance realm. When I want somebody to increase performance or increase output, I need to drive adaptation and I need to drive stress into that person. I need them focusing on striving and achieving a goal and on external kind of goals, basically. But when they're in PT or when they're in pain, they need to be more focused on their body and learning the kinematics and the way their body works, and on being able to control certain positions, learning to breathe, learning to decrease tone. So they kind of exist sometimes at different ends of the spectrum. And so having that integration is really critical, especially with our Combine guys, because I just don't have time in that small amount of time to really focus and put the effort into some of these more cognitive, biomechanical building corrective strategies that the PTs now have way more time to deal with. So it's been really beneficial for all of our athletes to be able to go back and forth between those two. Obviously, as long as their insurance checks out or they're willing to pay for PT. But it's a really easy sell a lot of times, because they can go in for a consultation or they can go in for, you know, a first session, and they can see the difference and they see us interact face to face every day. The PTs are literally right across the room. So if somebody is having a problem, I can walk right over and say, you know, hey, Jeremy, hey, TJ, those are our PTs in Hackensack. Like, what do you think about this? Like, do you have, Manalapan, you know, what do you think about this? This person's experiencing some discomfort during this movement. I've noticed this about them. Can you, get them on the table and take a quick look? Like, that interaction builds trust and builds rapport with our clients, because they see that we have their best interest in mind, and we're not the trainers who are just standing there screaming at them and making them work hard. So that integration is critical. And then in terms of kind of the whole private sector model, like, as I said, we have 7 locations. So we have places that are mostly general population clients who are just looking to look good, feel good, be healthy. We have locations that are a nice mix of all varieties of athletes, from track athletes to football to baseball to soccer. And then one of our locations in Hackensack, New Jersey, is pretty much about 98% elite figure skaters, which is a really interesting population to work with. And then in Manalapan, we have a lot of actually distance runners who are outside of the combine process. But then we also house the combine process within Manalapan as well. So each location has kind of taken on its own unique personality. And that's just from, I think, A, the connections that we have to the communities around there, B, the locations that we're in. Like Hackensack is in an ice skating rink. So we tend to just get a lot of ice skaters and hockey players. And then on top of that, just kind of it's a little bit more word of mouth, right? Word of mouth is huge in terms of getting people in the door. And once somebody has success, especially within a tight-knit culture like figure skating or like distance running, all of a sudden they tell their friend and their friend sends somebody in. And from there, they can kind of go through the process of both performance training and rehab, because, you know, most of these athletes who want to compete at a high level have something that doesn't feel right on them that they could improve to make themselves perform better.
So you guys both talked about an assessment. So is the assessment for the performance side and the therapy side integrated or similar, or are you guys kind of two distinct assessments in that front? How do you guys work those assessments for both the therapy and the performance?
So there's definitely similarities. I mean, I don't know exactly what Justin's assessment is right now. We used to do the same exact thing, but I start my assessments with, you know, after going over intake and goals and getting to know the person, with table tests. So just kind of some standard orthopedic table tests of, you know, passive range of motion of like hip flexion, internal rotation, external rotation, all that kind of stuff. Kind of, it's very PRI inspired. And then I go through kind of a modified SFMA breakouts. And I would say that, you know, so we only have one physical therapist, but it's my girlfriend, Pyle. She does very similar assessment. I mean, it's going to be specific to the body part, but where we're both very PRI inspired and it's PRI heavy. So a lot of the same table tests and orthopedic tests that we're going to do with kind of some SFMA breakouts. So when people do go back and forth, they'll kind of see the similarities and they'll see a lot of the same exercises in their programs from, you know, they might be correctives, or, you know, some of the warm-up activities we're going to do are going to be similar.
Really? Yeah. So, go ahead.
Right. So the only difference is then we're going to go to the higher level stuff. I'm going to do more of the strength training. Like I'm going to watch them lift in the assessment, and I'm going to actually put them through the performance assessment where I'm going to use a jump mat. I'm going to use gym aware and do our speed and agility testing. But they're obviously not going to do that with therapy.
Yeah, and pretty much the same for me. So Cody and I kind of came up together and kind of formed our assessments and our thought process on a lot of this together. So my first step is a long conversation with the person. We sit down, I get to know them, I get to know their goals. I ask a lot of questions about, you know, their history in terms of training, their history in terms of what brought them here. That's been one thing I've done differently in the last year, is really accentuate that. I think my appreciation of human behavior and getting to know people and communication has grown exponentially in the last year. And that piece of it has grown with that, and appreciating how important it is to just build trust and build a relationship, and found the training on that from the very beginning. And then after that, I go into table tests, orthopedic table tests, as Cody said. I think that tells me a lot, and much of my lens on coaching, not only movement and corrective exercise, but also just coaching performance-related movements, comes from PRI. And so I use a lot of the PRI-inspired table tests to get a sense of joint position, available degrees of freedom at the various joints of the body, figuring out where this person is presenting to me and where they are able to manage things like pressure and gravity, where they are restricted, and then where I can go from there to help open up more degrees of freedom for them. And from there, I'll use like a modified FMS, SFMA kind of breakout session. Sometimes it tells me something unique. Sometimes I'll cut out pieces of it because it's stuff that I've already seen on the table and I already know is there. But from a systemic perspective at Parabolic, the FMS is our foundation, because not everyone is as experienced or has learned the PRI principles. Luckily, many of the PTs that I'm working with now and the coaches that I'm working with right now have a good background in PRI, so we can speak the same language, and that makes things very easy. From there, we'll go into what we call the subjective movement screening, which is basically taking them through any and all exercises or basic movement patterns that I feel would be appropriate to put into their programming, so I can get a sense of how to appropriately load them and where to start, so that when I sit down to program for them, I'm not starting with a blank slate. Like, I know already how they're going to handle a squat, a hinge, a push, a pull. I've looked at them jump and land. I have an idea of how they run and how they move in more dynamic activities if they're an athlete. So that piece of it is important, because it takes what I saw on the table and now tells me, okay, they have this mobility or they have these degrees of freedom. Now, how do they control it? How do they manage it when I have them stand up and I give them a task like a squat or a hinge or a push or pull? And what happens when they have to apply some motor control to a specific task? And so that's an important piece of it. And then I finish up with the performance testing, much like Cody. I'll use the jump mat. That one was huge, especially when we're working with our figure skaters. And we'll use Gym Aware for low velocity profiling. And then I'll bust out the timing gate sometimes. We'll run a 10, we'll run a 5, 10, 5. We'll do a broad jump if they're an athlete, and I feel those measures are warranted. But in PT, it's very similar. It's just a different end of the spectrum. So they might go in and focus mostly on orthopedic tests and PRI-inspired tests. They'll do SFMA and SFMA breakouts. But then as they progress through PT, they start adding in performance-based measures, because eventually that is the ultimate goal of physical therapy. It's not just to alleviate pain or have the person move pain-free. It's like, if they're an athlete, we have to prepare them for the sport or for the activity that they want to do. So as they're able to do these things more, the therapist will integrate more performance-based measures, just like we will, and then the transition will occur to performance at the end.
Okay, so for some coaches out there that may not be familiar with PRI, can you guys kind of explain how coaches, how you guys apply different PRI principles into your assessment and into your correctives or your training?
Yeah, for sure. So I think definitely it's kind of formed the lens of everything we see through. Gus and I have both taken a bunch of courses, but we use their assessment, and, really simply put, most athletes you're going to see are in what we're going to call an extension dominant position or posture. And what this means, they're going to have a big rib flare, backs are arched. And when this happens, the pelvis tilts forward or goes into an anterior tilt. And not to say this is bad, you actually want this. Most good athletes are going to be in this position. You just have to be able to manage it and to kind of shut it off or have kind of the ability to do other things. So if you're always in this position, your body is actually going to reduce the degrees of freedom that it has available. And the way it's going to do this is by actually decreasing range of motion. So you're going to see big limitations in some ranges of motion that you should have if you're kind of too far into this position. So I'd say the most common ones I see, like a lot of athletes cannot internally rotate their hips at all. See a lot of limitations, and also a lot of limitations in hip extension lately. So those are kind of two really, really, really big ranges of motion that you should have available if you want to move well in the gym and be safe, be able to load up these exercises, but also even out on the field. Like every time you run or you cut, you should have the ability to extend a hip. And if you can't, you're going to be getting that movement from somewhere else, but you're also going to be lacking a lot of power. So anything you want to kind of add about PRI, Justin, like how it simply fits in?
Yeah, I think you hit on some big ones, is understanding that for a coach or for a performance-minded coach, that lens through which to view movement is really the most critical part of it. Most people that know that I'm kind of a PRI guy, or I've learned a lot of PRI and I integrate it, think that I probably spend a lot of my sessions like having people lay on their back and blow up balloons and breathe and do all these cognitive activities. But when you look at it, people might get 1 to 2 exercises at the beginning of their program, and that's really the extent of the direct PRI activities implemented in our program. The rest of it is the way that I view movement. And there's 3 main things I think that I can appreciate now that I didn't appreciate before. And that is how people manage the ground, how people manage gravity, and how people manage gas and pressure, right? And so those three things are critical, and that's when we're going to get to like talking about the squat or talking about the deadlift and how we coach those things. But as Cody said, a lot of our athletes are going to come in, they're going to be extremely extended, which means their ribs are flared up, their pelvis is forward, and they're using accessory muscles of respiration like back extensors, hip flexors, lats. They're pulling themselves into this position that locks us into the sagittal plane and minimizes degrees of freedom in all three planes of motion. And so that's critical. And then understanding that when I get somebody upright and they have to manage gravity, that they're going to do that in a very specific way. And they're going to have to, in many cases, extend further in order to feel like they're not falling on their face if they're unable to manage those structures that are more proximal to their body. And then the last one is gas and pressure, and understanding how movement of air in and out of our bodies and the management of pressure really impacts the available range of motion at our joints, the length tension relationships of muscles that connect to those bones, and then understanding that if I'm unable to move air in and out of the body appropriately, I'm going to have a really hard time moving in the ways that I want. And that's one of the big things that we work on with our combine guys who are coming in. These guys have all come from programs where everything is big back, chest up, arch harder. They've never experienced what it's like to actually have their ribs move, to actually control their pelvis, to feel things like hamstrings and abs that help to control those structures. And so that's a critical thing to teach them, because they're going to be restricted in their movement options if we don't address those things. And then the last thing that PRI has really given to me is an appreciation for the asymmetry of the human body and the triplanar nature of movement, right? Like people see someone walk and they think, okay, that's a sagittal plane activity. I'm moving forward in the world, right? But everything in our body operates in all three planes of motion. Every muscle we have works in three planes, and it moves our body in three planes. Every bone and every structure in our body moves in three planes. And so that appreciation, as well as the underlying asymmetries of the human body, allowed me to view movement in a much more effective light, and it allows me to coach movement with much more effective cueing, so that I'm not putting in people in positions where they're unable to optimize length tension relationships, or they're restricting their own mobility before they even begin the movement. And that's the critical thing that PRI has given to me.
So let's go ahead. Can you give some examples of what you guys may be doing? Talk about maybe some guys, you give them one or two correctives before the training session. What do some of those things look like? If you could have an example of an athlete and maybe what their limitations are, what you found from the assessment, and how you guys are attacking that via your correctives or your exercises that you're giving them.
So one example I've been seeing lately, a lot of people know like a 90-90, which is just where you're laying on your back, feet are up a wall. Mine is kind of posterior tilt with the hamstrings. So actually to get the hamstrings in a little bit of a shortened position. And then if you focus on a big exhale from there, you get the ribs down in the front, all right? You use some abs to do that. You can kind of help to offset that extension pattern a little bit. Another really big one I've been seeing lately is hip extension limitation. So I'll kind of use some PRI principles and kind of reinvent like a half kneeling quad stretch. So instead of just like grabbing the leg and gliding forward into kind of like the front of the acetabulum and arching the back, I'll have somebody put their hand, go in a half kneeling position, put their hands out in front of a box in front of them, and actually push themselves away or loose. What that does, it actually allows them to get their center of gravity backwards, which gets their ribs down. When you do that, abs come on. I'm then going to have them kind of tuck their pelvis underneath them, or posterior tilt, right? When you do that, that's a form of hip extension. So when you're doing that and just breathing in that position, continuing to kind of keep active abdominals and hamstrings, you get a huge quad stretch on the leg that's down. It's not really as much of a stretch as it is like an inhibition involving your nervous system, but that's kind of a common one that I'll put in someone's correctives if I see like limitations in hip extension mobility on the table.
Yeah, so a first example that comes to my mind is a combine athlete we're working with right now who's a running back, really, really fast kid, really athletic, has a history of ankle problems, and is currently going through PT as well as training. but he's having trouble integrating into running and sprinting and practicing the field drills because his ankles begin to hurt. And after going through our assessment and the PT assessment, there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with his ankles specifically. What we're looking at is somebody who is so extended that his calves, his lower legs, are the only thing that is actually A, holding him up from falling on his face, but B, extending his hip. He has no glutes, he has no hamstrings, he can't bring his pelvis underneath him, and so he's restricted in hip flexion, hip extension, hip internal rotation. He's restricted all across the board, so when he goes to run, it almost looks like his hips are like lagging 3 feet behind him. So he ends up rounding his shoulders forward and trying to chase after his shoulders with his hips way behind him, and he's running his feet really quickly because he's unable to express the hip flexion that we need to get. So he can't achieve a good acceleration position because his pelvis is anteriorly tilted. And when his pelvis anteriorly tilts, so when we go into anterior tilt, that's actually a position of hip flexion. The acetabulum moving over the femur into hip flexion is anterior tilt. And so when we have that position, we're going to see a couple things. We're going to shorten hip flexors. We're going to shorten quads. We're going to lengthen hamstrings, okay? And we're going to put ourselves in a position where our back extensors are chronically on, our abs are chronically inhibited, and we're unable to manage the pelvis and the rib cage and bring them back into a more neutral alignment. So when we take someone who's standing and we have that position happen where the rib cage and the pelvis are going forward, one of the strategies that person can use to make sure that they don't fall forward on their face is to push the front of their foot into the ground and actively plantar flex into the ground. Well, what happens when you do that is you end up with somebody with really, really toned up calves. And over time, if I'm unable to use any strategy other than that, I may end up with some overuse problems in those structures. And so step one for this kid, because anytime we have him run, he just immediately defaults back into that position of deep anterior tilt and extension. Step one is getting him some hamstrings and abs. Those are our sagittal plane controllers. They're going to posteriorly tilt the pelvis at the proximal attachment of the hamstring. And the abs are going to help not only continue to posteriorly tilt the pelvis, but to allow us to exhale, to clear air out of the body, and to bring the ribs into triplanar internal rotation, which means the ribs are going to move down, in, and back. And that's going to give our diaphragm leverage to now act as a primary muscle of respiration. And when I can do that and put the diaphragm in position to act as a muscle of respiration, I can now move pressure in and out of the body appropriately, and I can inhibit muscles that were chronically turned on for a long time. And things like that would be your hip flexors and your quads, and your psoas actually attaches pretty much completely right to the diaphragm's attachment at the lumbar spine. So you actually can't dissect those two structures out from one another. So anytime you have a diaphragm that's chronically turned on because it's not being allowed to move appropriately through good rib cage movement, you're going to have a psoas that is completely overactive and chronically turned on. So we need to start with the most proximal structure and that breathing diaphragm, putting that in a good position to work so that I can inhibit everything else. So for this kid, step one was just giving him a basic 90-90 activity where we're getting him some posterior tilt using those hamstrings. He's squeezing a ball to feel some adductors. He has a very narrow infrasternal angle, so I'm going to have him reach both arms forward to help bring the rib cage back, so that I can actually get him to expand the posterior aspect of his rib cage. So anytime he was breathing, he was essentially just moving his ribs forward in the sagittal plane, straightening them out and breathing through his belly, essentially. What I needed him to do was to exhale, reach, feel those abs move his ribs down in and back, and then keep those abs on as he goes to take an easy breath in. And keeping some tone in his abs actually pushes the air 360 degrees throughout the thorax so that we can actually manage that airflow. When the air moves back into the posterior aspect of that rib cage, he can now feel muscles all across his back lengthen and inhibit. And again, as Cody said, it's a neurological thing, but being able to move pressure is actually also going to allow us to inhibit some of those muscles that he couldn't shut off. And then the big one yesterday that actually made a lot of progress with him, I put him in all fours again, so that he could do a reaching activity. So hands are under his shoulders, knees are under his hips. He's going to reach through the floor to move his thorax back towards the ceiling. That's going to use some serratus on both sides to help our abs pick up leverage and to move those ribs down in and back. And then I have him posteriorly tilt gently. He then exhales to feel those ribs move, keeps abs on, keeps the reach, and then takes a breath in to expand that posterior rib cage. The addition that I made, because this guy needs hamstrings so bad, is I gave him some manual resistance on his heels and told him as he does that, try to push up with his heels on my hands. That gave him some hamstring facilitation in that quadruped position. And I continued to tell him to try to tuck his back pockets down towards the floor to posteriorly rotate the pelvis. And afterwards, we retested his squat, and he was able to pick up another 20 degrees of range of motion in his squat. It felt much smoother. He wasn't experiencing any limitations in dorsiflexion or pain. And so you could kind of see it in his eyes. There was this moment where he's like, whoa, like, what did you just do to me? But it's huge, because that now opens up a window of opportunity for him to be able to begin to utilize and make these degrees of freedom that we gave him stick, which eventually will allow him to adopt a better position during acceleration, which is going to be critical for improving his 40.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to go down that a little bit deeper here, because I think many coaches listening can, kind of agree with you guys that they get a lot of athletes that are just stuck into anterior pelvic tilt, and then they literally have no knowledge or education of how to get themselves out of it. Whether you cue them to death or put them in certain positions, but how do you guys get that athlete that seems to just be stuck in anterior pelvic tilt? How do you get them to posteriorly tilt their pelvis when they literally seem like they have no, brain wiring how to do so? And how do you guys progress that into your movement and into your lifts?
So, I mean, I guess it depends on what the whole assessment tells us, but usually we're going to try to either do something like an all fours position, where knees are on the ground, kind of like a bear crawl position with the knees on the ground. Or we're going to either manually or just tell them to tuck their hips, like Justin said, pull those back pockets kind of down towards the heels, reach up and breathe there. And that will help kind of shut off some of that extensor tone that's going to pull you into anterior tilt. Another really common one is the 90-90 that I mentioned before. So feet are on the wall at about 90 degrees. You're laying on your back. What I like to do is, especially if someone really has a hard time feeling their hamstrings, put their heels either on a bench or on 18-inch foam rollers. I'm going to tell them I want them to lift their tailbone off the ground just half an inch, but keep their back flat, and then drive their heels down into the foam roller. Now, this is going to allow someone to feel their hamstrings maybe for the first time ever. And those hamstrings are actually going to be the muscle that's going to allow the pelvis to posteriorly tilt via their attachment on the bottom of the pelvis. So essentially doing that, holding that while breathing, they should feel their hamstrings for the first time ever. If they're not feeling that, I might go to something like what I'll call a hamstring bridge with foam roller, which looks like an isometric glute bridge on a foam roller. Their feet are on the foam roller. All you're putting it there, so the hamstrings have to kind of isometrically contract to prevent them from the foam roller from kind of flying away. I'm just going to have them kind of tuck their hips up, reach their arms up towards the ceiling, and they should feel quite a bit of hamstrings there. So I'll use that with a lot of people to kind of get those hamstrings working again, okay, get some ab tone. That really helps to kind of shut off some of that anterior tilt.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I've taken away big time this year from listening to Bill Hartman and learning from him is an appreciation for the infrasternal angle of the athlete or the person. And looking at them, you don't even necessarily need to put your hands on them and measure it. You can kind of see how their thorax is presenting. People who have very wide infrasternal angles, they are very wide in the thorax and the frontal plane, right? They appear to have their ribs constantly moving out to the sides. And then the inverse is also true. You'll see people with very narrow infrasternal angles who essentially look very, very narrow at the thorax. They're very thin, not front to back, but side to side. And those two people could present the exact same way on the table. They could both be minimized, they could both lose internal rotation. They could both lose hip extension. They could both be minimizing hip flexion. And so we would look at them as the same, but now we have to appreciate that they're managing pressure and they're managing gravity differently. And so I need to apply a slightly different strategy. So For people with wide infrasternal angles, they need something. They need to find some sort of abs and hamstrings to help them regain sagittal plane control. And because they're so wide, the only muscles in the abdominal wall that are really well positioned to help them move their ribs from that wide position more inwards are the external obliques. And so the external obliques are going to help us pull those ribs in, but I need a more aggressive exhale to make that happen. And a lot of those people just can't feel what it feels like to have their ribs move in, right? They're mouth breathers. They're people who are hyperinflated, take really big breaths, me, for example. But when we get someone like that, I'm usually going to start them with 90-90, but with their arms over their head. And I'm going to put their arms over their head in order to actually pull their ribs up more in the sagittal plane. Because what's happening is if I don't do that, they're going to end up kicking on rectus abdominis. And rectus has very poor attachments to the sternum and to the pelvis. And it's really not good for manipulating those two structures. The EOs, IOs, and TAs are my moneymaker abs for moving the ribs. So if I put their arms overhead, I disadvantage rectus. I'm going to put their heels on a bench so that they can actually pull down and feel their hamstrings. And then I'm going to have them blow up a balloon or exhale pretty aggressively to make sure that those ribs move down, in, and back. And once I get them to feel their abs, I'm constantly asking them, what are you feeling? What are you feeling? And once I know they're feeling abs, I'm going to tell them to keep those abs on and take a small breath in through the nose. And then I'm going to have them exhale again aggressively through the mouth and get those ribs to move down. So much of this stuff is about sensory awareness and sense and sensation more than anything else. They have never even experienced what it feels like to have those muscles move those structures. So it's going to be very novel. And when you get it right, you know it. So that 90-90 position with arms overhead has helped a lot of our wide infrasternal angle people regain position for the first time. And then for people with a narrow infrasternal angle, like the athlete I just mentioned, as Cody said, quadruped is a great place to go. Sometimes I'll use what's called a standing bilateral IOs and TAs, which looks kind of like a flexed squat with my hands forward on a table. So if you can imagine someone standing with a table about waist height in front of them, they're going to press down on the table. They're going to squat a little bit with their feet flat on the floor, feeling their big toe, little toe, and heel. They're going to push their knees forward, and they're going to try to posteriorly tilt their pelvis. So they kind of look like they're in a flex squatting position, reaching their arms forward and pressing down on the table. And that bilateral reach and that squatting position is going to help facilitate some hamstrings. It's going to facilitate some adductors if I squeeze a ball, and it's going to allow me to push forward, which engages serratus. Serratus, when engaged bilaterally, is going to bring my rib cage back, and that's going to help my abs pick up leverage. And at the same time, because that person has a narrow infrasternal angle, I don't want an aggressive exhale. I want to use a softer exhale, a longer exhale, because they already have external obliques that are pulling the ribs in. I need to use something to help to pull those ribs down, in, and back so that now they can move their ribs posteriorly in space and they can expand that posterior aspect of their rib cage. So I'll go to something like that. I'll go to something like a wall supported reach, which is where they're squatting up against the wall. So you sit up against the wall, soft knees, reach the knees forward, posteriorly tilt the pelvis with the feet flat on the ground, feeling the heels. And then from there, they're going to reach down and forward, again, bilaterally, with the middle of their back up against the wall. So that full reach, again, brings the thorax back. The reach of the knees forward allows me to posteriorly tilt the pelvis and get some hamstrings and abs. And then I'm going to have them breathe there. And so that kind of activity is going to allow them to regain some sensation of what it's like to exhale fully. And then the final thing is using a balloon. Like, I think just a super basic tactile cue and external cue, like having a balloon provide some resistance for the breath. It really shows people, wow, like that's what it's like to actually breathe fully and to fully exhale. And so many people, from athletes to general pop, have never experienced what it's like to actually exhale fully, feel their ribs move, and then to try to keep that position and take a breath in. So the balloon can be a really invaluable tool when you're re-educating somebody who's never had that experience before.
Now, how do you guys take these positions, these cueing, these thought processes into, say, some of the big lifts, so like a squat or deadlift, where traditionally people are taught take a big breath in, arch hard. You know, how are you guys taking this information and applying it to the big lifts? How are you guys teaching setup? How are you guys teaching your descents or whatnot in the squat and deadlift?
So I would say 100% kind of how we coach it is extremely important. So before we even get into that, we have to make sure we're doing kind of the right variation of it for them. So our progression and regression list is very influenced by PRI. When Justin and I kind of created the modules, that was actually my favorite one. We came up with, excuse me, like 8 different like variables that will actually either influence the progression or regression of an exercise. And depending on where you put the load or the placement of the load relative to someone's center of mass will kind of influence how difficult it is for the person to perform this exercise. So, for example, if somebody is very extended, it has a big anterior tilt, this is actually a position of, where they actually control their center of mass forward. So if you look at them and put like a plumb line down from the side, you should see like their hips and everything out in front of them. So the best way to counteract this standing is to put a weight out in front of them. So say we're talking about a squat and you put a weight out in front of this person, this is kind of push their center of gravity further forward. They're going to have no choice, right, if they don't want to fall over, but to actually push their center of mass backwards. And the best way to do this is by getting some posterior tilt of their pelvis. So if you've ever seen someone squat, either with like holding like a light weight in front of them, like a reaching plate squat, or with heels elevated on a board, all that's doing is putting the weight out in front of you, which forces the athlete to kind of sit back or move their center of mass backwards and posteriorly tilt. So that's kind of like the starting point for the regressions. And then kind of as we go and the weight gets heavier, we still try to keep the weight out in front of the body rather than putting it behind you like a back squat. And just doing this kind of saves you a lot of verbal cues, but can help get the athlete into a position of a little bit less extension. So they're squatting with a little bit more like hamstrings, glutes, and abs rather than just relying on back extension. So we'll go up through something like a goblet squat from there, double kettlebell rack squat, and then either to a front squat or a safety bar squat. So when we're doing this, I'd say there's a few cues that we're probably both looking for. When we set up, right, instead of getting a big arch for stability, we want to get the rib cage and the pelvis kind of facing each other a little bit. So we'll cue and exhale, get the ribs down, tuck the pelvis up a little bit at the top. And when we go down, say we're talking about like a squat, instead of sitting back hard and arching, we're not going to cue that. We're going to actually to allow the knees to track forward. I'm actually going to tell someone I want their knees to track as far forward as I can while still feeling their heels on the ground. So hips are going to go back as knees go forward. What this is going to do is it's actually going to allow you to keep some more active hamstrings during the squat. So it'll allow you to keep – you're not going to get a posterior tilt, but you're going to get less anterior tilt. So a little bit more back to neutral, okay? This is going to keep them more upright, and they'll be able to squat where they're still loading their knees, which is actually a really good thing, right? A lot of people think they just want to load hips, but you're going to be able to load your knees and your hips without placing like this massive amount of stress on your back when you're actually trying to load the legs on a squat. So that's kind of like the overview of how we might, teach and load a squat kind of based on these principles.
Perfect. So I'll take the deadlift then, since I agree totally with everything Cody said about the squat. In terms of the deadlift, and this is one that we see this time of year is where I'm thinking about this a lot, because every athlete comes into me having come from a program where their coach says, chest up, arch hard, grab that bar and rip it. And like, I see them come in and all they feel is their quads and back extensors when they deadlift or when they hinge in any way, shape, or form. And I used to be the exact same way. And I never understood how people could say that the deadlift was a hamstring and glute activity, because I never felt it before. And I just posted something the other day where I was like, when you can manage your rib cage and your pelvis, all of a sudden the deadlift becomes one of the most brutal ab and hamstring activities you can possibly engage in. And it's all about loading the tissues that you want to load appropriately from the very beginning. So let's take a trap bar deadlift, for example. Again, I'm going to take them through a progression. So I'm going to start with a basic bodyweight hinge, and I'm just going to watch and see how they move and how they manage their body through that. And I'm going to take them from a bodyweight hinge to either a pull through or a kettlebell deadlift to either a dumbbell RDL or some sort of RDL like that. And then for a lot of people, because it's going to be their biggest bang for their buck exercise, I'm going to transition to a trap bar deadlift. But I'm going to try to make sure that each of the technical cues that I'm about to tell you about are present through every single one of those strategies. So when someone's setting up for a deadlift, I was always taught, and I always saw people basically round their back, round over, and grab the bar for step one. And then they would sink their hips down and back and get their chest up, and then they'd push from there, right? Or they'd pull from there, quote unquote. The problem with that is when you round your back over, the only thing you can do to now get into position to deadlift that trap bar or deadlift that bar is to extend, right? You're in a flexed position when you grab the bar. The only thing I can do now to straighten my back is to extend it. So I'm going to be loading my back extensors. And when I load my back extensors, they're going to help pull my pelvis forward and my rib cage up, along with everything else we've talked about today. So I'm now loading my extensors and my quads, and people will wonder why they can't feel anything else. So for me, a good deadlift setup or a good hinge setup starts from the very beginning. As soon as they step into the bar, I'm going to have them feel their entire foot on the ground. So I want them to be able to feel weight of their body going through their heels, but I also need them to keep their big toe and their little toe engaged with the ground. So after they've gotten that full foot contact, I'm going to have them reach their knees forward a little bit, because knees reaching forward is the same as arms reaching forward. Anytime I can reach an appendage forward, it's going to allow me to move the more proximal structures of my body and my center of mass backwards. So now that I'm reaching knees forward with my heels still on the ground, I should see the person's pelvis and shoulders move straight down if I'm looking at them from the side. Not back, not forward. They should be sitting straight down a little bit. I'm going to have them posteriorly tilt their pelvis, and I'll say, like, tuck your belt buckle to your nose or pull your back pockets towards the floor. Either one of those cues seems to get people to be able to do this action pretty well. And then if they're still not getting it, I'll demonstrate it for them and have them just do it with me. But the idea, as Cody said, is I'm not telling them to round their back or posteriorly tilt. I'm taking them from a position of anterior tilt back into a little bit more neutral position. And what this does for me is it allows my hamstrings to go from an eccentrically lengthened position back to a more normal resting tension length. And from there, if I want to actually load my hamstrings in a deadlift, I can't start with them already eccentrically loaded, because then they're just going to get basically out of room, right? My brain's not going to allow me to load them any further, or to stretch or lengthen them, or to eccentrically load them anymore. So now that I have them in a good position, I'm going to have the person exhale at the same time that they hinge their hips back, keeping those knees soft. The exhale is going to help to drive the rib cage down, in and back, and it's going to help my abs keep leverage and keep control of that rib cage. And so right there, if they do that correctly, a lot of times the person will pick up a lot of range of motion and be able to hinge much more smoothly than they were before. And they won't feel the tension developing in their back. They'll feel it in their hamstrings, in their glutes, in their abs. And we haven't even touched the bar yet. So now that they're in that position with the full foot contact, I'm going to have them reach down and grab the bar. And from there, continuing to feel their abs, I'm going to tell them not to stand up or pull. I'm going to tell them to push the floor away from them. I always want people thinking push through the floor, because that's going to give them the awareness of the fact that I want them driving through their legs to push themselves into a standing position, not pulling themselves up, which is going to drive extension every time. So for me, it's all about loading the structures appropriately before they start. And once they grab that bar and they stand up the way we talked about, I'm going to have them finish straight up and down. I'm going to have them exhale at the top to make sure they're still feeling those abs and still feeling a full foot contact. And then I'm going to have them reverse it. They'll soften their knees. They'll hinge at the hip to push the hips back while they keep those abs on. They're keeping a full foot contact with weight through the heel, but also feeling and keeping their big toe and little toe on the ground. And then they'll go down during the eccentric portion of the lift and push through the ground once again. And the reason that's critical is, as we said before, length tension relationships of muscles. We know that muscles are not going to contract optimally if they're eccentrically lengthened to a certain degree, or if they're too constantly concentrically shortened, right? So I need to put muscles in a more neutral position before I start in order to appropriately load them. And hamstrings are a big one. If my pelvis is anteriorly tilted, I have no chance of eccentrically lengthening and loading my hamstrings anymore, because they're already eccentrically lengthened. And then also in terms of range of motion, if I want to deadlift, I need to be able to express hip flexion. That's pretty obvious, right? But if I start in anterior tilt, it's like hopping on a 10-floor elevator on the 3rd floor and asking it to go up 10 floors. Like, I don't have that room anymore. So anterior tilt is hip flexion. So I'm starting in hip flexion, and then I'm asking my body to express full hip flexion, and I'm just not going to have it anymore. So if I can get that person to reach their knees forward, exhale, bring their center of mass back, posteriorly tilt their pelvis, bring their ribs down, now I have a position of more neutrality, or closer to neutrality, where I can express full hip flexion, load my hamstrings, glutes, keep my abs, helping my back extensors stabilize my entire thorax all the way around. And now I can push, and all of a sudden the deadlift becomes a hamstring, glute, quad, ab, and lower back exercise. And it's extremely effective, extremely trainable, as opposed to somebody having to miss many sessions because as soon as they do one deadlift session, they're like, my back is smoked for 6 days. So that right there, between the squat and the deadlift, for me, are probably the 2 most important things that I've taken away from PRI. It's just an appreciation of how to appropriately address the most basic of exercises that we utilize and make them more trainable.
Awesome. Cody, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I totally agree with that. That was awesome. I think the one thing I'd like to say is, like, me and Justin can talk about this stuff all day, and, you know, and the PRI stuff, but, like, the goal for coaches is not to, like, get super into this or to spend a lot of time doing the stuff. Like you'd be surprised how little we actually do the actual correctives. It might take 5 minutes of a session at the very most, when most people would be like foam rolling, right? But, like, the goal is to train. The goal is to train really hard and to get really strong and powerful and fast. So when we're doing this stuff, like, we might only be cueing somebody like this in the beginning, maybe the first few weeks of it. Like, it should become pretty autonomous after that, you know, after they've established some good positions. And the goal is to train hard. I just kind of want to, you know, like, highlight and go over that, because I think a lot of coaches, when they might hear of this stuff, they might kind of think that we're using it a lot more than we currently are, or that, like, the goal isn't to train. But, like, the goal is always to train. We're just using this stuff and what we've learned to allow people to train a little bit smarter, so they can kind of continue to train harder in the long run.
Awesome. So let's transition here to you guys. You know, Justin, you're currently working with your combine athletes, and Cody worked with them in the past. But, you know, so you're prepared for the pro day or the combine, and obviously the 40-yard dash is king. So, what are the most glaring problems that you have when athletes are coming into training, and how do you try to address those things?
So, I mean, we've hammered one of them big time today, which is control position, right? And track. It's funny. I was going through the USA track and field manual the other day, and level 1, and I came across a page where it actually said that anytime you have the pelvis anteriorly tilted, you're going to restrict hip flexion and movement around the hips. And anytime you do that, you're going to lose front side mechanics during sprinting, and you're going to end up utilizing more backside mechanics and potentially setting yourself up for injury. And I thought that was, like, incredible, because I've never seen that stated in, like, a track and field type manual before. I've seen, you know, Charlie Francis talk about the sprint position. I've seen other track coaches talk about the importance of front side mechanics, but I've never seen them state that so clearly in a text. And I thought that was huge, because that is the foundation of how we're going to teach athletes mechanics. And so their biggest problems all stem from that. They can't get into the positions we're asking them to do. They can't express that good 45-degree angle at projection coming out of their 40 stance. They can't get their hip up in front of them and then strike down and back into the turf to propel themselves forward, because many of them can't express hip flexion from that position. Many of them don't know what it's like to actually be able to express full shoulder range of motion either. And at the same time, even though there's not that much of it perceptively during straight ahead sprinting, we need some trunk rotation, which is what our arms are driving during that process. And many of these guys, because they can't move air, they can't rotate their trunk either. So they're very stuck in that sagittal plane motion. Their shoulder movement is limited. Their ability to extend their hips and to push, and then to also express hip flexion to allow them to actively strike during acceleration, is limited. So they're very backside mechanic dominant. They're not able to get front side, and that's going to restrict their ability to achieve some of these positions that we're asking them to do during acceleration. And then the other two are kind of misperceptions that I think they've been taught through school or through their coaches throughout the years. And one is you have to stay low, which is just not true. And it's brutal to try to break them out of that habit. But understanding, it's amazing once they start to feel it, right? To teach them how to push and project out and how to naturally allow themselves to climb out of their stance and to rise more comfortably into the sprint position over time, and that they don't have to just force themselves to stay low. That's a huge piece of it. And I think, obviously during acceleration, we want to take off at a good angle. We want to have an angle to allow us to put force into the ground to propel us forward as opposed to up, right? And I think that turned into a cue where people were like, you have to stay low at all times. And what most athletes take that as is, I need to force my body low by rounding my shoulders and my head forward towards the ground. And so a lot of times when we assess these athletes, we see guys who are trying to force themselves into a low position by rounding their body forward, by reaching their face towards the ground. And what that does is, if you do that on your first step, you're not going to get a full hip extension and a full push through the ground. You're not going to get full hip flexion on the front side. And therefore, you're going to strike the ground earlier than you really want to. And your immediate strike of the ground with a vertical shin, because you can't actively strike back, is going to push you straight up in the air. So these guys who try to force themselves to stay low coming out of the gate end up standing straight up within 2 or 3 steps. So it actually has the opposite effect. So a big key is that we're teaching them to push out, right, rather than try to force a low position, and then to allow themselves to naturally and just gradually rise as they continue to strike back into the turf. And then the last one is just patience. So they come in and their idea is that in order to sprint fast, I just need to move my feet as fast as I possibly can. So we see guys who come out of their stance and they're just really, really, really running and putting their feet in the ground as fast as they can. And what we know about acceleration is when I'm trying to overcome inertia from that 3-point stance, I need longer ground contact times in order to apply more force to the ground. I need to push and I need to project my center of mass out and up in order to drive myself out of that 3-point stance. And so ground contact times are longer, more force is being applied to the ground, and that's okay. And that will continue to speed up. Ground contact times will shorten as I go, but these guys need the patience to learn to push out of their stance and to actually put force on the ground and project themselves out.
Yeah, I mean, I think Justin took pretty much everything I had. The 2 main things I was thinking were definitely the stay low, because that's like the most common thing I do. And other one is just like trying to force it. There's no like relaxation or rhythm to anything. So even just learning how to kind of inhibit it and get a little bit of like that pulse can really help. Another thing that is super common, this is not as common as staying low, but a lot of people are taught to cover ground, and they're taught to do that by reaching. So instead of actually driving the ground down and away from them, they're just putting a lot of strain on their hamstring, just trying to reach themselves or pull themselves forward in the first few steps. So that's definitely a pretty common one. Another common one is just not covering ground at all. And it might be because these guys have done ladder drills where they just think that they have to like continuously move their feet as fast as they can, but they just have no ground contact times, and they're trying to move so fast, but they don't understand that they actually have to like cover ground to get there. And then obviously the really important thing with the 40 is to start. None of these guys have ever been taught how to actually do a proper 40 start before. So that takes weeks and weeks to even get them into like a decent setup position.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. How do you guys teach the setup or the stance for the 40-yard dash?
So what I'm finding right now, what I'm doing currently is really individualizing things a lot. So I'll start from a pretty basic template of things, but it's amazing when you watch people run the 40 really well year after year. You're going to see such a variety of stances that they're just really, at this point to me, I'm like, there is no one answer. And when I see people teach one specific setup, to me, it doesn't make sense, because everyone is built so differently. They move so differently. They have different strengths and weaknesses. So it's a process of trial and error to start with something and then try to move the person around and find what is optimal for them. So essentially what we taught this year was we basically gave them a number of different options through which to kind of measure their feet off of to figure out stance distance from the line in terms of both feet. And then we're teaching them to try to keep a little bit of weight forward. So what we'll take is we'll take their off leg from the front of the line, and we'll say we want either you to put your front toe to your ankle bone or right behind your heel, like right to the tip of your heel. So you're about a foot or just under a foot away from the front of the line that you're going to take. If we have somebody who's really, really big and who struggles to be able to get a good angle of that front shin coming out, we might back them up a little bit more. But so far we haven't had any guys with that problem. And then we'll take the back foot, and we'll put that either to the heel of the front foot if they feel more comfortable in a very closed kind of bunched up stance, so their back foot is 2 feet away from the line, or we'll use the knee, and I'll put that knee in line with the toe of their front foot, or the knee in line with the ball of their front foot if they feel like being a little bit more spread out. And then we'll use test and retest. We'll say like, hey, how did that stance feel? Let's try this. Let's look at a 10 coming out of each stance. Like, let's look at objective laser times and say, okay, how does this feel? But also, how does it affect my ability to get out in time? And then we're filming everything. And so from that position, once the feet are set, I'm going to have them put their knees on the ground. I'm going to have them walk their hands out until their hands are under their shoulders. I'm going to have them pick their knees off the ground, and it should be about 4 hand movements in. So they're going to move their offhand back, 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 and then they're going to grab the line or put their hand on the line. They're going to bring their elbow back so that they're getting their hand towards their back hip. I don't like going like super far back, and I'm also not a big believer in keeping the hand in front of the body. I think they need to be in a position where they can actively shoot that front arm forward aggressively and quickly right off the start. But I don't want that arm to be so far back that the person who's running their hand time sees that as the first thing that moves and starts the time way before they've gone anywhere. And then the final kind of key to their stance is going to be making sure that both feet are anchored to the ground and they have their weight forward. So I want a decent amount of weight going forward so that their shoulders are over their hand and over the line to a position where they feel a little bit uncomfortable with how forward they are. And that's going to allow them to push and project out right away and to chase their shoulders into that acceleration angle. Too many people, I think, get too comfortable sitting back into almost like a deep squatting position, and they may feel powerful there, but that's going to cause them to shoot straight up coming out of the gate because they're putting force into the ground more vertically than they are horizontally. So I want that forward position. And again, I'm going to play around with that and see where they're comfortable and where the times and the actual execution of the sprint lead me to believe this is the optimal stance for them.
Cody?
I got nothing to add. That was perfect.
Awesome, guys.
I've done it in a while, and he's kind of right in the middle, so that was a really awesome overview of it.
Cody knows how these first 2 weeks go. It's always a fun time. Everybody learning, we get a good hand time on them. We get a good laser on them. Some guys are a little surprised by what their times actually are. And then it's a process of, each day just trying to figure out what is optimal for them. Cause I was actually talking to a friend of mine, Mike Baker, who's a mutual friend of me and Cody's. And, we were just saying you have 8 to 10 weeks to teach essentially track-like principles to athletes that have never been exposed to them before and that some people spend their entire athletic careers trying to master. So it's definitely an interesting progression when you're first getting to meet these guys and first building that rapport and then getting them set up from the beginning and starting to implement these principles.
Yes. Well, great, guys. I really appreciate this has been a great episode. I mean, we're over an hour right now of just loaded information. Real quick, where can our listeners find you guys on social media or learn more about you guys?
So I'm on Instagram. My Instagram is at Cody Plof, and then my gym, so Adapt Performance and Rehab. It's at Adapt Performance and Rehab is our Instagram. Tweet a little bit, but not too much. And then if anyone wants to connect, feel free to add me or message me on Facebook.
And I am on Facebook. My name's Justin Moore. I tend to be a little bit difficult to find there only because there's a country singer named Justin Moore, and so apparently it's tough if you just randomly search me. But I'm actually most active on Instagram, JMSB_strength training, all one word. And I put up a lot of stuff on not only my story, but all through my, Instagram page, whether it's just me lifting or different thoughts that I have. I post a lot there. A number of articles that I've done have been published on darksidestrength.com. I believe it's dsstrength.com. And those are a number of articles, a lot of them about mobility and movement and the way I integrate PRI into performance training. So if anybody's interested in a lot of the topics that we've talked about today, I'd recommend checking those out. And then the gym I work for is Parabolic Performance and Rehab, and they have a website, goparabolic.com. I've written a few blogs for them, and you can see some of my work there.
Well, great, guys. I really appreciate you guys coming on Sunday, taking the time, and sharing such in-depth information.
Thanks for having us, Mike. This was awesome. Really fun.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having us on, definitely.
All right. Appreciate it, guys. Join me in thanking Cody and Justin for a wonderful episode today. I mean, that was jam-packed full of information from those two, and they did a wonderful job. And I appreciate you guys listening, and I hope you guys can go give Justin and Cody a little shout-out and thank them for their time and sharing such in-depth information. And we hope to see you guys next time on the Elite Performance Podcast.